This is an interview with Harold and Gladys Halverson for the Valley Historical Project. And this project will be part of the Silos and Smokestacks project. The interviewer is Harriet Blockus, and I'm assisted by Ken Blockus. Put your face in, Ken.
This is okay.
The date is February 2nd, 1999, Groundhog Day. And we're at the Halverson home, and the sun is shining, and so I guess we'll have more winter. And we'll start out thanking you for this interview. This will be used to help the heritage of our region. It may be used for educational purposes, and it could be to promote tourism. And so we'll start out with Harold, and Harold's going to go through the name, date, and so forth.
Okay, Harold O. Halverson, and I was born June the 27th, 1916, near Postville, Iowa, in Alameda County. And my parents were Albert and Bertina Halverson. And I have two brothers and three sisters. The brothers are Devere Halverson, lives in Elgin here, and another brother, Louis Halverson, that lives at Stoughton, Wisconsin. And the three sisters were Frances, she's deceased, Irene Rudin, she lives at Winona, Iowa, and Lil Hansel, she lives at Washington, Iowa. And that's about, Gladys can tell more about the grandchildren if you want to hear anything.
Did you have any of your family that immigrated?
No, my family the family was all born here. My mother and dad were born in this country, but then I think their grandparents came from Norway, see?
Yes.
But not any closer than that.
Okay.
And I'm Gladys Halverson. I was born in Wisconsin. I'll even look at the one near Wazeeka, Wisconsin.
Here I thought you were born at Gunder.
No, I lived in Gunder. When I was, I suppose, about 3-4 years old, we moved to Gunder. But I didn't start school there. I started school at the Barbary School. So then I was born there in Wisconsin, but I have to look at what you've got down here that you need to know.
Where, the date?
The date was 1919 and June 29th. And my mother was born in Wagner Township near here. But my dad was born in Norway. He was 1 year old when he and his parents came across the ocean. And he had his first birthday, and the day after they had the shipwreck. It was funny how we got the information about this, because 50 years after this happened, it came in the Dekora Posten, which was a Norwegian newspaper. And they had happenings that happened 50 years ago. And we've translated it into English. And this, he came over on this ship, the Thingvalla, and it was hit by another, both were Danish ships, but this ship of his was hit. And they had quite a number of people that drowned. I think they said there were 148 people aboard the two ships, and only 50 people survived. The ship that my dad was on was in the best condition. The other one sort of steered off course, I guess, was blamed for the shipwreck. And it was, my grandmother used to tell about how they'd be throwing him they'd take children right out of their arms and going into the ocean. And it was quite a pathetic sight to see. And it was stormy, and it was very foggy. So that was why they had the shipwreck.
Did he stay on the ship?
He stayed on the ship. Their ship was okay. I mean, it was damaged, but it was in good condition. The other one was cut in two, and it really took care of a lot of people.
Now, where did this voyage start?
It started in Norway, and it was near Halifax where this happened, when they were getting close to the United States.
But it was a Danish ship.
It was a Danish ship, and the one that hit them was a Danish ship. And it was going from here to Norway. But it was a well-traveled area, so they had help quite quickly. So a lot of them were saved that couldn't have been otherwise. And it said the first report came into Norway 3.5 days after it happened. It took a while for news to get around.
A little different than nowadays.
Yes, right. So that is my parents' story.
Maybe I should add a little bit to my name. Our name hasn't always been Halverson. If you go back over to Norway, we'd have to go back to the name Skrindi, Skriinde. Because when my great-grandfather came over, his name was Halver Skrindi. Then he had a son who was my father, and his name was Halver. So then, of course, from then on, being his Halver's son, it became Halverson. But my father is confirmed by the name of Albert Skrindi out in East Claremont Church. And I suppose he was baptized by the name of Albert Skrindi. And I just found that out this summer, and I was going through some of the records out at the East Claremont Church.
But then he isn't buried that way.
No, he isn't buried that way, and he's the only one that was confirmed by the name of Skrindi, and all of his brothers and sisters then took the name Halverson. See, but he was the oldest one of the family, so then, of course, he kind of took the name Skrindi.
Well, like the Blockuses also one time written in the Bible were calling themselves Olsons.
Oh, yes.
And the Gilbertsons started out Gulbrandson.
Oh, sure.
And when some of them went to school, they went by Hendrickson. And then they finally stuck with Gilbertson. So this is what, when they were always the son of the farm or something.
Yes, the oldest son got to keep the name. Those that moved on they were the son of the father.
So that's why it's hard for me to understand how they trace these families when they go back there.
It's almost impossible. In fact, my cousin was over in Norway, my cousin's daughter rather, was over in Norway trying to find out something about my dad over there. And she had quite a time, and of course she came back. She says, I found something on a Nels Peterson. Well, that is my dad. He changed it after he got here. His dad's name was Carl Peterson, so he changed it and it made it Peter K. Peterson.
Yeah.
K just stands for initial, it isn't his name.
Okay, is there anything else you want to add about your Norwegian heritage? If not, we'll move on to education. Your early, just briefly about your education, and we'll talk about the teaching later.
Okay, I went to high school in Claremont and Elgin, Claremont and West Union. And in West Union, I took the 2-year normal training course, and I graduated with the teacher's degree in normal training.
But where did you go for your elementary years then?
We got that right in with our normal training.
So I meant when you were a kid.
Oh, and Claremont grade school and a few country schools. Okay. Because my parents were renters and we moved around 2-3 times during our schooling days. So I had training in rural schools and the Claremont grade school and high school.
Did you move in March?
We usually, March the 1st was moving day.
No one's talked about that every March there would be a lot of changes in the neighborhoods.
Right.
And Gladys, you want to tell us about your education briefly?
I went to the Barbie School.
Now, where is that?
That's, it's as you go out towards Postville. From under to Postville, there's a road that goes north, and that goes to Postville. And then the school is right down by Miller Building's place.
Okay.
Miller Building was one of the pupils. Okay. And I didn't have far to go to school because Miller Building was the closest. He was there regardless because you didn't close down schools in those days. If the weather was bad, you had it anyway. I remember one day, my sister was older than I, about 3, and she 3 years older, and she wanted to go to school, and I did too. And Mother said, no, I think you better stay home. Snow's pretty deep today. I don't know, I think you'd have trouble going. And I cried because I wanted to go. But then she came home, after she got halfway there, she turned around and came home, which probably didn't make sense either, but that's what, then I felt a lot better, that I didn't have to stay home alone.
You want to tell about your high school?
I went to Postville High School, rode with other people, Hilderupson for a while, Miller and Hallam for another while,
Now, when you say road, what did you ride in?
just a car.
Model
They'd have
A?
Yeah, probably.
Back in those days, Model A was the main transportation. Yeah.
I remember one time we stayed, one year I stayed up there because there wasn't anyone driving, went to Postville High School. But one year it snowed so bad that north-south road was completely filled in for days. They didn't have the snow plows that they do now, and they had to dig down through.
It wasn't
And you
like-
could see pictures of it with a whole bunch of men on top of these huge snowbanks trying to get through so they could get that road opened up.
It wasn't in the 36.
Close to that,
Next
yes.
to that.
Yeah, it must have been that,
Yes, because
because I graduated in '39.
All right.
And that's the year I stayed up then. And the people in Postville took us in, and we all got to stay a couple of days in somebody's home up there.
That was always fun.
That was
If
nice.
you couldn't get back home, you could stay with friends or relatives in town.
I didn't have relatives in town, but it was a banker's wife that took us in that time. It was a lot of fun.
And after high school?
After high school, I started teaching as he did with my normal training certificate. And I did go to summer school once in Upper Iowa and once at Luther. And that was all.
Would you like to tell us about your wedding, your marriage?
Well, go ahead, guys. You tell about the date. Was June the 10th, 1946. And I remember it was a disagreeable rainy day. And I was worrying about that Ryerson Hill because that was not gravel at that time. And but we got to the church all right. And go ahead, Gladys.
Well, it was, I don't know what else to add to that. It's just
It
a
was
good,
after the war you were married.
yes, right. After I quit teaching then after he got back from the service because he was in the service for 4.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I quit my teaching.
Okay.
And of course, the pastor was Pastor Stranyard, and he was there for, I guess, about 30 years. So, and the one that played the organ was not Mrs.
Henry Velson.
Yeah, Agnes Velson.
Oh, Agnes.
Yeah, good old Agnes.
The one that always gave piano lessons.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yes, I always heard a great deal about her.
Yeah.
Would you like to just briefly tell about your children?
Now we have 2 children. Steve is working at the Iowa City Post Office, and Diane is married to Eric Amundsen, and she's living out at Humboldt. And he's the
Service manager.
manager of the airport out at Fort Dodge. She started a job too now. She's working in a dentist's office, which she used to do in
Charles.
Charles City.
And they have children.
They have 3 boys. They're working in Cub Scout work, Boy Scout work. That's how she broke her arm just lately. They took them all as their Christmas party was roller skating, and they roller skated with them. And she was doing fine until they told them to skate backwards, which she did twice and did fine, but then she put a little bit more speed on and that didn't work. So she has a broken arm. She's working.
I suppose she wanted to show off. Well, I can skate backwards, and I'm sure I can go fast. But she went a little bit too fast, and the end result was a broken arm. So
That was too bad.
yeah.
Okay, now we've kind of covered the basics, and so we have some topics that we particularly would like to hear about. And if I just said early childhood days, what comes to your mind, Harold?
Well, DeVere and I were just 2 years apart, and we played together, and Gladys doesn't believe it when I say we never fought. And I can't remember us fighting like brothers and sisters do now. And of course our toys were mostly improvised toys, and between the 2 of us, I know we had one wagon, a big little red coaster wagon, and between the two of us, we had one bobsled, or little hills type of sled that we used to slide downhill. And other than that, growing up in the Depression, it wasn't the toys like the young children are used to having today.
Did you ever go swimming?
Oh yes, we went swimming. We'd go what we called it swimming, but it's really mud crawling. And of course we wouldn't get in too deep of water. So always when we went after the cattle, we'd go down the pasture, and Mother would always warn us. She says, "Boys, stay away from the creek." Well, when we got out of sight, out of mind, you know, so we'd go into the creek and take our clothes off and mud crawl a while. We called it swimming, but it was just more like mud crawling.
What did you do in the winter?
Oh, in the winter time, it was the sports was sliding downhill or going to our neighbors and playing, and the night night fun was more or less occupied by playing cards with our family and playing games. And we didn't have our main games were like not dominoes, but checkers and what else other game that was so popular? Checkers and Monopoly wasn't.
Did you play Rook?
Yeah, Rook. Yeah, Rook was always fun.
Did you play Somerset?
No, I never learned to play Somerset until after I got into the Peterson family, and then her mother. That's a Norwegian game, Somerset is. So I learned to play Somerset then. Otherwise, it was just not bid euchre so much, but rummy and 500. Yeah.
We played Somerset. I guess that's one of the games that we did learn. I don't think I could play now. I don't know that much about it. Maybe I could.
So they go by colors, don't they now? Isn't the colors?
For
No, it's Somerset. No, it's
Oh, by the number. Okay.
double 12s
Okay.
and all that.
It's fractions.
It's fractions,
Yes,
yes, okay.
Right.
That's
Only a
right.
Norwegian would think about to play a game with fractions.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, I know sometimes the neighborhood would get together with a few here who used to play Rook, wasn't it?
Oh, yes,
Rook,
yeah.
and of course that's with color.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah, that's with
right.
colors, yes.
that's the color one with the crow.
With the yes, right.
Carol didn't tell though that his mother hid the cards on Sunday. He didn't play cards on Sunday.
Oh yes, it was the old Norwegian custom was that the cards were hidden away on Sunday. So Saturday night she'd hide the card deck, and of course that was a sin to play cards on Sunday. And even other little things like if a button came off your shirt, you pinned it on. You didn't sew that button on Sunday. I don't know if your folks grew up that.
Not quite that, but we couldn't play. We never had the regular playing cards. We
Okay.
had Somerset and Rook, but
Oh,
we
but
never
that-
had the other kind in the house.
Okay, yeah, okay. Well, I guess the symbol of the other kind of cards with the Joker was supposed to be the devil,
Yeah.
and the devil was not supposed to be in your possession.
And then some people, say, kings and queens.
Okay.
And I suppose when the immigrants came, you weren't going to show any partiality to kings and queens.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
They had to be very careful.
Okay.
Even during the war, you weren't supposed to speak Norwegian.
Or German.
Yes, I'm sure.
German,
Yes, right.
Do you, you've talked about quite a bit about a little social life here, but I wondered when you were real little, do you have any special doll or anything that you remember?
Oh, I remember the dolls, yes, but Mother would always, we probably had clothes for the same doll in a few years. They were new clothes, but they were the same doll for a while.
You would get a new outfit at
New
each
outfit.
Christmas.
And we lived in a house where we had a stove pipe going up through the upstairs, and my sister and I slept in the room right up there, so that was our busy times. We had to look down there to see what was going on in Christmas time, what new things were going on.
And
Maybe we'd get something, we'd already know what was going on.
if the pipe went up through your bedroom, that kept it warmer.
Oh, sure it did. It was nice and warm up
So
there.
you were glad to have that room.
Bet.
Yes. Okay. Now, would you like to just go ahead and tell us about maybe some Depression years, something about what happened there? You want to start out, Harold?
Well, yes, I went through high school during the Depression years, and I worked myself through high school because when I finished 8th grade, DeVere was the farmer in the family, and he wanted to stay home and help Dad, and Dad didn't need 2 boys, and according to Dad, back in those days, 8th grade was a climax. Then you go out and get a job. So I said, "No, I want to go to school." So I got a job, and I worked in gas stations and coast-to-coast stores and grocery stores, wherever I could make a nickel or a dime. And sometimes when the end of the week came, I just had a nickel or a dime left over after I bought my books and clothing and so forth, and I had to decide whether I needed paper for schoolwork more than I did shoelaces for my shoes. And of course, I've told my kids that once in a while. Yes, Dad, they say, but that was in the olden days, just like it was 200 years ago. But it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. But it didn't hurt us any to work ourselves through school. I think maybe you appreciate your schooling a little better then because you worked for it. And I never regretted it. It was I paddled my own canoe going through school because I didn't get any help other than just my own self.
Well, I went through the 8th grade, and by that time, I had friends like the Upson girls who were going to high school. They were driving. My dad didn't believe in higher education at all. He didn't let my sister go to school. She was I always feel bad about that because she didn't have a chance to go through school. And I did. Then barely got a chance because the Upson girls were determined that I was going to go to high school. And they would stop for me every single morning for 2 weeks. And finally, Dad relented and says, "Well, I'll go then." And
So you have a real...
I have real appreciation for high school.
Especially Hilda Upson.
Yes,
That's Mrs. Morris Amundsen. So she gets the credit for Gladys continuing her education.
And as of course, I was 2 weeks late. Can you imagine coming into high school 2 weeks after school has started and a green freshie? I came home that first night. I went upstairs and I cried, but I didn't let my dad see it. I went back to school and I loved it. Thankfully, algebra was very easy for me, and so I got caught up in a hurry. But I'm glad I got to go.
It's hard to believe that our parents didn't insist on higher education. They insisted on more or less getting out and working and making a living by little jobs rather than further education. And now it's just the opposite. You know, education you can't take away from you. And
those that lived through 29, 30, 31, and then the drought, don't you feel that they were really wanting their children to be self-sufficient?
I think that was the secret of it.
And so you probably, Harold, have more memories of the Depression than Gladys. Let's see, what's the age difference between you two?
I was born in 16 and she in 19. So
No,
I
had recollections too because we were on a farm, and the fellow that had loaned Dad money wanted it back. He was getting scared. He wanted his money. And so Dad didn't know where to go. And finally he got help through the government program that was going on at that time. I forget what the initials of it were. But it was that he got a loan.
Oh, yeah, I think I know what you mean, but it just won't come to
I just
me.
won't, I should have written that down, but no, he got help.
FFA?
No, it wasn't FFA, but anyway, it was
It wasn't through the Department of Agriculture. Like when we were watching Grapes of Wrath, that's what made me think of that.
So he had some pretty hard years that he was very afraid that he wasn't going to keep the farm. They lost theirs, but we hung on by the shoestring because that loan did come through. And that was one happy day.
Well, the Depression were worse years than a lot of them realized because my father was always a renter. And of course, you'd rent a farm for cash, so much a year. And I remember this one particular farm we rented, which was the cash per year was $2,000. And it was right during the middle of the Depression, and Dad just couldn't make $2,000 a year. So our landlord sold him out. He sold all the cattle, the horses, and the livestock. And we thought that in order to get his $2,000, he'd even take some of the furniture. So they took and hauled this chiffonier that you see in there, this china closet, and hauled it to the neighbors because it was an old family keepsake. So my folks had to, back in 1933, had to start over with nothing, with borrowed money, and start farming again.
That
So
was risky and scary.
You bet you're risky and scary, and nobody realizes what a loss it is. I'm thinking now of this farmer up by Castilia. He was so depressed and so pushed against the wall that he went out and robbed the bank. But in those days, you just existed and did what you could to exist. And I admire my dad for starting over in the Depression with nothing. But just us.
And they had a big family to take care of. It wasn't
There were 6
only
kids.
2 of us, so that wasn't quite so hard.
But we had nobody we could borrow money from. And while I was in high school, I had an appendectomy. And we had to borrow money from a relative to pay the hospital bill. We didn't have insurance. That sounds kind of a little bit ridiculous too, comparing to today's method.
But it was risky.
It was risky.
You really sometimes had to depend on your relatives.
You bet.
Especially if they were having a little better luck than you were. And I think relatives stuck together better. Sometimes there was hard feelings that resulted in these things too. So while we're there, why don't we go into, what do you remember? Did you both live on farms?
Yes.
I lived on a farm until I finished 8th grade.
What kind of farming memories do you have?
Oh, my farming memories was hard work. Gosh, milking by hand. I wouldn't know how to run a milking machine because all the milking was done by hand and everything was done by manual. We'd pump the water and carry the water to the house for drinking purposes and for bath purposes and for household purposes. Carry the water out again. Feed had to be carried. And we had no sheller that we'd shell the corn, manually operate, just a hand crank sheller, and cleaning the barns manually. No barn cleaner or no device at all because we lived where there was no electricity, and therefore manpower was the power that did the work. Muscular.
Ditto. No boys in our family. So I was out in the fields too, and I milked the cows. And I remember thrashing time especially, it was we had, I think about 26 cows we milked, and the thrashers in that ring kept on until late at night. So by the time we got them all fed and they went home, and if they were working at some other place, they were so late coming home that we had to do the milking, so Mother and I did those 26 cows quite a lot. And,
how long did it take, do you remember?
oh, we had a race, but I don't remember how long it took.
Actually, in our family, the women were faster milkers than the men. Mother could milk much faster than Dad. And sometimes the girls would help us milk, my older sister Frances and Irene. And we'd bargain with the girls and say, we'll help you with the supper dishes if you go out and help us milk. Because Devere and I thought it was kind of nice and comfortable to wash dishes in a nice warm kitchen rather than milking cows in a cold barn. So we traded back and forth with our little jobs. Worked out good.
And I worked out in the field too with, driving the tractor for the wagons for haying and for picking up shocks and so forth.
Did you ever do any shocking?
Yes, I did that too. I wasn't real good at it. My mother was better than I, but she did a lot of it.
I didn't mind shocking, except barley was hard to shock. Because the bristles in barley, and they'd get down in, prickle, they get down in your pants, but we'd always put our shirt over on the outside, and then it'd have a tendency to shred.
Would you tell what shocking is? Some people might not know. That word has a different connotation nowadays.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
correct.
the binder produced the bundles. And of course the bundles came out, and the bundles were, I'd say they'd probably weigh about 10, 15 pounds, and we'd put 2 bundles, just like you would put a little teepee. Then we'd put 2 on each side of this first 2, and then we'd brace that with a cap on top of it, see? And the cap was supposed to shed the water in the event that it rained. And of course it always rained between cutting the grain and getting it harvested. And other than that, it's kind of hard to describe what a shock is.
I think that's very good,
Uh-huh.
and that will help people know what shocking was, because that isn't something that we know too much about.
Some of these words change their meaning through the years, don't they?
Did your mother can a lot?
Oh, yes. a lot, and I'm sure his mother did too.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
My
We had
mother
big gardens.
would think nothing of having 100 fruit jars.
Yeah, right.
Oh, yes. In the fall of the year, the cellar was full of fruit and vegetables. And we'd go out into the timber and pick gooseberries and elderberries and anything that was cannable was canned. And now the freezer have taken the place of that, see? And, canning was sort of an art too. You had to be particular that the jar is sealed and all that little detail.
A lot of cooking of it
Yeah.
too.
Oh, absolutely.
Did you can meat?
Oh, yes. Everything but the squeal, I guess. Remember the kitchen floor with all the apparatus there, they're grinding the lard, and I hated the smell of lard.
Matter of fact,
And when they
our
were-
excuse me.
When they were rendering it, I didn't like the smell of lard at all.
Our basement is like a store, and Mother always says, if I have coffee, sugar, and flour in the house, I can prepare for any amount of company that comes. And they could, because they had sauce in the basement, they had canned vegetables and fruit, they had their meat, and they made their homemade bread. So she says, I could prepare a meal for any amount of people. She says, if I've got coffee, sugar, and flour. Those three things are very important.
Do you remember when electricity came to your
Yes.
place? We'll start with Harold.
Okay, the folks got electricity, I think it was the year 1943, because I was overseas at the time, and I remember getting a letter from my mother, and she says, finally, the REA has come through our part of the country, she says, and the first thing I'm going to buy is a refrigerator. And a refrigerator is what she did buy. And gradually, other equipment as the years went by. But the first piece of equipment was a refrigerator. And otherwise, we did all our studying by lamplight.
Because you didn't have Delco plants.
Oh, no,
Many
we
have
didn't
talked
have,
about those.
Yes, no, we did not have.
Do you know what year that was?
Oh, that was, I think, in 1943. I was overseas at the time. But I remember that letter as if it came today. How Mother says, the first thing I'll get is that refrigerator. To store things in, you know, your butter and your...
The year was, I think, approximately the same that we got the electricity, because I was teaching school already at that time. And we were very happy to get home and have those lights, because like, ditto for everything he said about the things you did without the electricity.
Remember some of the first things your mother may have wanted to buy? Did you
I guess nothing as spectacular as that. I suppose it was a refrigerator was one of the first things also. But I don't really recall what she came up with first.
I think a refrigerator was a big one for us too, and the milking machine. And then what I remember was the yard light.
Oh, yes.
No more lanterns.
Yes, we got rid of doing the lamp chimneys every Saturday morning.
Right. It really did change the life of a farmer, didn't it?
Very much so.
Okay. Is there any more that you would like to talk about the social life, how it was different when you were a child and growing up than it is now? You've already mentioned about card games and things.
Mm-hmm. Well, we visited neighbors more often then, and I can remember the folks putting us in a bobsled in the wintertime and crossing the field and visiting the neighbors, and it was just a social event that it seemed like you kept more in contact with your neighbors then than you do now. Because now sometimes 4 or 5 days will go by and you don't see your neighbor or don't talk to them. For otherwise, I think you appreciate your neighbors more. Also, they exchange help back and forth. If you need help, the neighbors would come and help you, whatever you needed help with.
And we didn't do as much of that. But I know he always speaks about how they always used to get out in the wagon. And I don't recall doing very much of that at all. We would neighbor with the very closest ones, it seemed, but that was
Did
about
you
it.
use a horse and buggy then, ever? Or were you always having a car?
No, we had horse and buggy, but they didn't. He must have been more adventurous. They would take that horse and buggy and go a lot, but we didn't.
I was born up by Postville, Iowa, and my mother would want to go and see her mother that lived about 1.5 miles north of Claremont. And I was born north of Postville. And Dad would hitch up the team and buggy, and she would put my older sister and me and DeVere in the buggy and drive from Postville way down to Claremont in the team and buggy.
How long did that take you?
Oh, I suppose that was about 8 miles or so. And of course, I suppose the horses trotted then like the Amish do now. They're always on a trot.
Mm-hmm.
But she'd think nothing of it.
Did either of you ever take the train?
No, the only experience I've had was train is I've been on a train back and forth twice to the east, to the west coast, but that was during the army traffic.
Did you?
No, not until later years.
Because the train
I went
probably
with
didn't.
Lena Baumgartner when she had to go to the eye doctor in Chicago a couple times.
But not when you were a child.
Not when I was a child, no.
Okay. Now let's move into about your military life before we start with teaching. Because did you teach before you were in the
Yes,
army?
I taught 3 years before I went in the
Well, we can probably bring that out later. Let's
Okay,
do
fine.
your military and
Okay.
get that out of the way.
I wanted to say something about travel because I came from Wisconsin and there was no bridge across the Mississippi River. So
Oh, really?
we went across on a boat,
On a
on a
ferry.
ferry.
Where did you cross?
We
In Prairie?
crossed at Prairie.
On a ferry.
And you had to be there at a certain time, and you had to make sure you left over in Wisconsin from our relatives at a certain time, or you'd miss it. You'd have to wait another hour before they came back again. So we did a lot of traveling across the Mississippi River in the ferry.
That's really dating us, isn't it? When you think we were born right after Columbus discovered America. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there was no bridge across the Mississippi River.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I remember when I was a child, we had to pay $1 to go across that bridge.
Oh, yes.
Because they were still trying to pay for it.
Yes, right.
I don't know what year it was built, but I know when back in the 30s, we paid. My dad says we can't go across because it would cost $1 to go across and $1 to come back. And he said that's just too much money just to go over there for an hour.
You can imagine Dad and Mom moving from Wisconsin with their cattle and everything coming across by ferry. There's no other way to do it.
Okay. So let's go back to the military and get that taken care of.
We'll go back now to 1941, and I was supposed to have been drafted in December in 41, but I was deferred until school was out, so I was drafted in June 41, and at that time we were supposed to serve 1 year in the military because Hitler was going through these neighboring countries over Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Bulgaria and all those neighboring countries, and he just marched in and invaded them. They didn't fight. They just marched in and took over. So, of course, Germany got so large and expanded, so our president at that time was F.D. Roosevelt, so he saw the need of a larger army because the army then was only volunteer army, just men that volunteered. So they enacted what they called a conscription. And everybody from the age, I think, 21 to 39 had to register and serve 1 year in the military. And then after you had your 1 year in the military, you went back to your previous job. They were supposed to hold it open for 1 year. So I had over 6 months in, and I was really going down the hill. And one Sunday morning, we heard that the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor. And that busted the bubble. And I was in 4 years after that, because then you were frozen and you couldn't get out. And then
December 7th,
December 7th.
1941 changed your life.
That changed my life. And we were later sent overseas. We were first sent to the Mojave Desert in California for desert training because they thought they'd send our unit to North Africa and fight against Rommel, was it? And they give us 4 months of strenuous desert training under General Patton, blood and guts Patton. And then they, after 4 months, they sent us back to Fort Leonard Wood, reorganized us, and turned around and sent us back to the West Coast again, and sent us over.
They're running out of tape.
That would be.
We're too long-winded.
Did that run out, or did you?
No, it just run quick.
Yeah.
But it hadn't been running?
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden I saw it was stopped.
Okay, so then we were sent overseas to the South Pacific, and our first landing was at Pearl Harbor and Oahu, and we were there for 4 months for jungle training because our desert training didn't do us any good. So then that's the Army's way of doing things, right way, the wrong way, and the Army way. So then we had to take 4 months of desert training in Oahu, and from there we went further overseas to New Guinea. We landed down at Pearl Harbor at Milne Bay, New Guinea, which is right across from Australia, and we leapfrogged up through New Guinea, Dutch, British, and French New Guinea, and from there to Luzon in the Philippines. And we landed up at Lingay and Gulf. And did you want me to tell a little bit about the Philippines? Yeah, okay. So we landed up at Lingay and Gulf, and I was in the 6th Division, Infantry Division, and our division split up, and half of us went down to Bataan to clear that, and the other half went to Manila. And our group that went to Bataan, after we cleared out Bataan, we went over to Corregidor, the big rock, and cleared that out, then back to Manila. And from there, we leapfrogged or fought our way up through the island until we got to Baguio, which is the summer capital of the Philippines, Baguio, Luzon. And I think it was 100 days of continuous combat that our unit was in, so they saw the need of rest and relief. So then they said that this unit has to be pulled out and sent for a little rest. The men were getting burned out, as you call it. And we were halfway between Baguio and Manila when we heard that the bomb had been dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So then, of course, that ended the war. So then 4 months later, I was back in the United States. I could go on and on, but that's just a synopsis. Yeah.
What was your, I just wanted to ask you, what was your work when you were in the Army?
Okay, my rank was a staff sergeant, and I was in the medical detachment as a staff sergeant, and we carried a M1 rifle, but we fought right up with the troops, with the medics. You were a first aid man in the medical department, and of course we couldn't wear our Red Cross badge because the Japs would rather shoot a medic than they would a regular GI, even though we were all GIs, but that kind of more or less pointed us out. And if you get a medic out of commission, maybe you get, it's worse than a GI because your aid for the wounded stops. And then also the ministers never wore their badge on their collar either. They didn't wear their cross. So you never knew who was next to you, whether it was a major or a colonel or whatever. And at one time we made a ship-to-shore landing, and we were very much disorganized. And my major says, why don't you go and connect up with the unit and see what units are on each flank of us? Because I was a staff sergeant, of course, when you were fighting, you had when you were treating using your medical experience, you had to fight. So I know I was going up and down the coastline trying to figure out what units was on each flank. And by the time I asked 4 or 5, everybody's mixed up, 1,000 troops landing. And this one fellow, I got a little disgusted wanting to know who was on each flank. And I says, who in the blank around here knows something? And he lifted up his collar, and under there was a full-fledged eagle. I was talking to a colonel. And, that kind of, so I says, excuse me, I'll continue on my way. And I finally we connect up. But you don't ask a colonel who around here knows something.
That's a good story.
Yeah, I thought it was too, but it didn't embarrass me because I couldn't get my question answered.
Okay. Now what I'd like to move into is your teaching in the rural schools when you came back from the war and your experiences.
Okay, I hadn't been back more in about a week or so, and the superintendent contacted me. He says, I need you, he says. Teachers were scarce then. And so then I taught in a school south of West Union. That was a little different type of a school. They call it above standardization. It had, the floor was just like in a gymnasium. We never had to use a broom, just a dust mop. And it had inside and outside toilets and water there. And it was kind of almost like a town school because you had all the conveniences there. Far cry and a telephone also. But over in Dover 6, before I went into the service, that was also that was a school that also had a telephone. And one time when we really needed that telephone badly was, do you remember the November the 11th back in 1940?
Yes.
When it all blankety blank
Almost.
broke out. And I know the kids came to school that morning just in short sleeves, without a jacket. It was real balmy. And thought nothing of it. And about the first recess, it started to cloud up, and this, from the northwest, it just got hazy looking. It started to get terrifically cold. And by noon, it was so cold and the ground was frozen that the phone started to ring. And I guess the parents thought I'd be sending the kids home. And they says, leave my kids at school. Don't send them home. I said, oh, no. I said, they'll stay here if we have to stay here all night. I said, we all got dinners to eat. I said, we got plenty of food. I says, and we'll get along here. But every parent came after the kids. And you'd actually get lost crossing the field where you thought you were. Well, you kind of remember that, don't you?
Blizzard.
Yeah, it was just a bad blizzard. And around here, they lost a lot of turkeys and animals. People froze to death up in the sloughs.
And the fruit trees froze.
And the fruit, yeah, right.
My mother was out trying to get stuff out of the garden, and she sent us to town with the neighbors. And I can still feel how terribly cold I was. Just
Chickens up in the trees and you couldn't get them out.
My car froze up going home that night because back in those days, we didn't have Presto. We had alcohol in the radiators. And of course, I had to get down and pull in the lower gear, and the radiator started to boil, and of course, alcohol doesn't stand in the boiling point as water does, and alcohol boiled out, see. So then I had to stop in town and get more alcohol and put in my radiator to keep the radiator from freezing.
how big were your schools, and how did you teach in those days?
Well, teaching then I think was just about like it is today. As far as I know, we taught all the subjects that was required according to the Iowa course of study. And I've taught in every grade, I think, from kindergarten through 8th. And I know the second school I taught in had 25 kids. And it was kind of interesting. The bigger schools were more fun than these 15, 20 size ones because
Gee, I only had 8. It got bigger.
yeah.
But.
Well, of course, the big ones had helped the little ones. And you'd be surprised. It seemed like these great big boys and girls were kind of mother and father over the little ones. And of course, with me, this one particular school I was called for because they needed a man up there because the school was getting to have a bad image. And they contacted me, so I said, I'll dare. So I did. And we just got along like brothers and sisters. I was a kid out in the playground and roll around and play with them and be a kid, and in the classroom I was Mr. Commander. So, of course, they respected me.
You used your Army tactics on them.
I believe that helped. The Army tactic helped, yeah. And no was no. It wasn't maybe.
Why don't you tell how much you got for teaching school back in those days?
Okay, I started out at $50 a month. And I think you started out the same.
Same price.
Yeah. And that was the going rate because I think the town teachers were getting about 75. And we were getting about 50. So then, of course, when they wanted me to stay on, I said, I'll stay on. I said, but it's a big school. I said, I need a $10 a month raise. Well, they had to have a school board meeting. And that was asking a lot from 50 to 60. Today, I realized I had a lot of nerve to ask for that big a raise. But they had a school board meeting, and they kept me. Well, then as the time went on, I ended up getting $130 a month. And that's the same pay as a staff sergeant's pay in the Army. So but I was satisfied. I thought 130 was a pretty good pay when I started out at 50 some years before.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you get out of teaching?
Oh, I had a chance to buy a store up at West Elgin here. And Ben Baumgartner was a cashier of the Elgin Bank, and I happened to be in there in a little business. He says, "Say, Harold," he says, "I have a sister that's running a store up at West Elgin. He says, how would you like to go in partnership with her?" And I thought I'd do it for 1 year. So Ben Baumgartner was the one that insisted that not insisted, but he encouraged me to, so I did. So I thought I'd try it for 1 year and then go back to school again because I wanted to pursue teaching. Well, I was up there I started with the intention of staying 1 year and I stayed 30. See?
Before we talk about the store, maybe I'll ask, Gladys, do you have anything to add about teaching in a rural school before
Well-
we go on to your story years?
I have to say that my first year of teaching was very different from his because we were neighboring schools, and it just so happened that I had 6 girls. That was all I had. You had 9, I had only 6. And they were all girls. And there was another school not too far from us who had 4 boys. We got our pictures in the paper, naturally, because we were a little different.
Did you have a telephone? No, we never
Oh,
did.
no, I didn't know telephone.
But I think before our country school closed, they may have had one. I'm not sure.
Well, that's the only school I taught that's still standing there. It's used as a shed. But his is on the registry, I guess, for.
Well, that's
Special
Dover
schools.
6 school. They're trying to
Oh,
get
you mean
that.
Donna Seitz?
Yes, yeah, I was up
Mhm.
there this first
Donna
year.
Seitz is the guardian of that
Yes,
She
she
sure is.
school, and it's good someone does preserve one.
And it's such a nice area. It's such a large yard. We just had a little tiny yard in ours. But we didn't need too much for 6 girls.
No, that wasn't fair either. Her teaching 6 and getting the same
Same
wage as me teaching 25.
Right.
But it wasn't as interesting because there was only one grade that had 2 children, 2 girls, and the rest were all single grades. And it wasn't as interesting.
No
I taught
competition.
bigger schools later.
Well, now we'll move back into your buying the store, and would you like to tell us a little bit about the store? And I would like to have you include something about what this whole upper town, I call that upper town, you call
Yes.
it West Elgin, I
Yeah.
also call it Lutra,
Lutra.
and
Okay.
all mean the same place.
Yes, it's the same area. And just before I get into our business, I was just going to tell you some of the business that used to exist in West Elgin. They used to have 3 grocery stores up there, and a hardware store, an appliance store. They're kind of hand in hand, but they're 2 separate buildings, and a bakery. They had a restaurant up there, a lumber yard, and they had a block business. Leo Boland and a Holzer used to make blocks up there. And they had the canning factory, which you're all familiar with. They had a millinery store there, and a cigar store, a 3-story hotel, the depot, the old Legion Hall, you remember that, okay. And Adam Boland had an egg station up there, and he bought hides and anything that was saleable.
He also had a grocery store.
And he also had a grocery store. Shorey Brothers had a stockyard up there, Al and Ern Shorey, and you recall those 2 men. And they also had a brewery up there. And the brewery is over in the vicinity where Charlie Capper lived, between that house and going toward West Union.
That was
See?
a
So that
busy place.
it was a busy place. And
Could
And-
you explain why all of this was in West Elgin or Lutra or Upper Town, and then there was a Lower
Lower
Town?
Town.
Can you explain how that came about?
I wonder if the railroad didn't make a difference. See, the railroad came through the west part of town, and it was the CRINP, if you know what that means, Chicago, Rock Island, Pacific. And that train was just like the rooster crowing in the morning when it's time to get up. We'd hear that whistle coming and going. It was kind of an invitation sound. I enjoyed the train coming through. And when we first came to Elgin, our train depot agent was Pat Langsdale. Does that ring a bell for you? Yeah, Pat Langsdale. And then it changed.
I remember Erickson.
Yeah, Erickson, later on. But those are some of the businesses that existed in that end of town. And I give it, for all those businesses that was there, I give the railroad its credit. And the railroad, I gotta tell another little story too about the railroad. They tried to keep the railroad alive because Shorey's did a lot of shipping. And of course, that all the livestock was shipped in and out of, and the cars used to come in by rail. Torkelson's and Bob's cars came in by rail, piggyback, like the semis haul them now.
Can I stop here? Could you give us an approximate date when this was happening? What years?
Okay, well, I think it started to fall down, I'd say maybe after World War II.
So this is prior to World War II.
Yes, prior to World War II.
Okay.
And could I tell you an interesting story about the railroads? Fred Millendauer run the furniture store down here. and the funeral business, and he was very hep up on keeping the railroad alive. He says that's what's keeping the town alive. And thinking back to all these towns that have died, they pinpointed back to the railroad being pulled out. So whenever Fred ordered furniture, whatever he ordered by the carload, he says, I want it shipped by CRINP, by the Chicago, Rock Island, Pacific. So they put it down on their invoice, shipped by rail. Well, one day, a shipment came in. That's when Fred was living yet. He's been deceased for many years. And he happened to make the appearance just after the load of furniture was unloaded. And he says, how was this shipped? Well, he says, we trucked it up from Cedar Rapids. He says, put that furniture back on that truck and haul it back to Cedar Rapids. He says, I will not accept it. He says, I ordered this to be shipped by rail. So about the truck driver was very reluctant to loading that up again after he unloaded it. But he had to do it because Fred was commander of the business down there. So they loaded up, and about 3-4 days later, it was shipped by rail. It came the way it was. So that's just one little example of how some in your community fought to keep the railroads alive. And if they're all like Fred Millendollar, I don't think his family would mind me mentioning this story because I think it's interesting and it's true. And maybe we'd have still had a rail today. Yeah. But I had to throw that in.
Okay.
But I thought it was kind of cute.
And now, before you, well, why don't you go ahead and start with your story about your store.
Okay.
But don't forget Jakey's after we get done with this.
Okay, yeah. Well, I can put in Jakey first. Why don't we do that
All right.
first? Okay. Well, Jakey had a service station between Elgin and Lutra. And his service station was kind of like a little halfway station. He handled candy bars, and later on he handled bread, and just a little kind of a one-stop place for emergency things. Even on Sunday, you see cars in there getting ice cream and bread and so forth. And what was handy was the high school kids would go over there during recess and fill up on candy and pop. And sometimes Jakey would say, well, I hear the bell ringing. And he says those kids would hightail it across the street. And Jakey was such a good guy. I know we tried to keep the price of coffee uniform. Of course, it's called price fixing when they try to keep all the stores. But I know between Fob's and the Locker and Toma and me, we tried to keep coffee the same price. And I know one time Jake was about a penny cheaper per pound. So one of the businessmen remind him that, oh, he says, what's a penny? Yeah, what's a penny?
Jakey used to say that a lot because, you know, I
Yes.
came here in 1951 and I can still remember him saying
What's
that.
a penny? And of course, back in those days, you know, nobody ever filled their car back right after World War II. They hardly ever filled their tank full. And kids would come in, high school kids, and they'd want 15 cents worth of gas or 20 cents. Well, Jakey would give them just what they ordered. And good old Jake, he was a good businessman, and he worked 7 days a week. Now getting back to our store, is the place of business. I was going to stay for 1 year and stay 30. But I want to mention one clerk that I had for 25 years, and I would have had her for 30, and that's Selma Coles. That's Gerald Snyder's mother.
We have a tape of her.
Oh, do you? Well, that's good. I can only give her credit for everything she did because she was there. She never called in sick, I don't think, or anything. She was always on the job. And if I'd say, Selma, let's wash the ceiling down today, she'd have that step ladder out there and the washcloth, and she'd probably be up on the ladder and the ceiling before I would. And if there wasn't anything to do, she had that dust rag in her hand, and she was always dusting the merchandise off, even though they didn't need it, but she had to keep busy. Those hands had to keep busy. And she was dusting here and there and the other place. So I can only say good things about Selma, although I had other good clerks too. Margaret Roberts was there for several years, and we had Judy Frieden, she'd help us out. Mrs. Bob Chapman would help us out, Sheila. They were all good clerks. But Selma was there the longest, and she would have been there for the 30 years I was there, but 4 years she moved to Waterloo when she married the second time. And then when her husband died, she came back, and I rehired her. And other than that, we sold groceries and meats and dry goods. It was a one-stop store. And when we were first there, we had men's overalls, boots, shoes, 2-buckle boots and 4-buckle boots, and all sizes of overalls, and ladies' dresses. And Gladys was in charge of the dry goods department, where I was more or less in charge of the grocery department. So she can talk about the dry goods.
Yes, we had a lot of fabrics, and we did well on those fabrics. And but now you can't find a fabric store within miles. You have to go to the city if you want anything like that.
Postville's about the only place, and that's
Yes,
not true.
Postville has it. That's
Food
right.
runs,
That's right.
and that's
Yeah.
about it.
And Selma was the greatest clerk back there. And we had to get her a left-handed scissors because she was a lefty. And I think she probably still has that scissors with her.
That's not a joke. There is a left-handed scissors. See, there is.
And yes, I know that from
Yeah.
teaching school.
Mhm.
And I remember that you really had lots of good materials, like when our kids were doing 4-H projects, you know, needed to
I
sew.
enjoyed that.
We would come down there and lots of selections.
And I had to laugh when he mentioned Judy Frieden helped out once in a while. She and I took their pickup, old Herkimer, and went over to pick up apples at Gay's Mills for the store. We had more fun on that trip.
They had a pickup, I'd say, I don't know, it's average size pickup, and they could get 25, 30, 40 cases of apples off at Gay's Mills.
Yeah.
And it was cheaper going up there and getting them, and I could sell them by the bushel. And we did a lot of business in West Elgin.
Now, Gladys told me you sold a lot of things in the bulk, and you had, where are those?
I decided
Okay.
with the clock that was enough, but if you want to get them, that's
No,
fine.
I've got some of those scoops out, but they're just a plain ordinary scoop that you scoop coffee and sugar and rice. Yeah, we sold a lot in the bulk because it was just a little bit cheaper, and we'd package it ourselves. And anyway, to save money, and of course, it was a little extra work rather than buying everything ready packaged. But if you could save your Mr. and Mrs. Customer some money, more power to us.
Got to be nice after we got to have self-service. We didn't have to go get everything off all the shelves ourselves.
And you delivered groceries.
Yes, every Friday was delivery day, and I'd have about, I'd say average every Friday, maybe 15 or 20 stops, and it'd be away from Canada, across the river, and way down to the east end of town. And it meant something to bring something into a person's house that was probably not handicapped, but didn't want to go and grocery shop, and it paid me to deliver. But may I tell a little story about delivering? I was down at the bank one time, and there's a lady that saw me across the street. I won't mention any names because in business we don't mention names. But this lady saw me, and she was over at Torkelson's Locker, right directly across from the bank, where the Apple Valley Cafe is now. And she says, "Harold, could I ride home with you?" I says, "Absolutely." So I says, "Okay," I says. So when I got through my business at the bank, I went over there, and she was outside the store. She says, "I have a big box of groceries in the Torkelson's Locker. Will you go in and get them and carry them and put them in your car?" I says, "I sure will." Well, then of course I carried her groceries out, took her to where she lives. When I got up there, she said, "Would you please carry them in the house for me?" So I says, "I sure will." So I carried them in the house, and those are the comical little things that happen, you know, and I just wonder if my competitor would have done that if he was up in my end of town and carried somebody's groceries out and delivered it.
I tell you what, that's your Army training. You
Yes,
do what you're ordered to
You
do.
betcha. So, and that good lady, she didn't think any more of that than if she'd have bought the groceries. But the next day or two, she was at my store, and she was a pretty good customer of mine, except she happened to be downtown, and she didn't drive. She had no transportation but her feet. So I thought, well, you know, that's a kind of another star in my crown, you know. And I just, but to me, it is comical, and I also remember the day.
You better,
You didn't think
Yeah.
we could Do an hour?
Well, I thought maybe we should get that clock in, but would you tell me why you sold the store?
I didn't get exactly burned out, but I kind of wanted to do something different. And I thought, well, as long as I'm able now, there's other things in life to do too. And I thought, why not try a different occupation? So I sold the store. I advertised. I sold it to Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, the Margaret Roberts and Leonard's son. So he and his wife bought it. So then I went back to school again. I took a course in medical technician work. I got it through North Iowa Technical Institute. Helmer. And I got a certification of a certified nurse's aide. See, and I went out to the county home and I worked out there for about 4 or 5 years. And that was the most fun to do. That I wished I'd have stuck with that, because working with those, well, they weren't all senile, but nowadays they call it Alzheimer's. Then we'd call it childishness, because about this time of the day they'd come. We didn't have locked doors. Everything was free to come and go, but we had to watch our residents.
Now this was
At what is now Prairie View, but at that time it was a county hospital.
Fayette County.
At Fayette County Hospital, and they had a hospital wing up there, and every once in a while someone would expire there, and that's before all these nursing homes sprouted up. Postville didn't have one, and neither did West Union. And as soon as these nursing homes sprouted up, which was great, then all of the patients that weren't ambulatory were sent to the nursing homes, and that relieved us a lot, because we usually cared for, I would say, around 80, 85, 90 residents out there, patients. And then as the time went on, they changed the name from County Hospital to Fayette County Care Facility, and later on to Prairie View. But then I was approached by Ralph's Funeral Home here if I'd like to change jobs. So that was in 1980. So I've been at the funeral home now for 20 years, working there.
And so, would you give us your age?
Yes, I'm 82.
And you're still working?
I'm still working, yes. And we were busy last week. I'll tell you, we had a funeral down at Cedar Falls, this young couple that was killed by Al-Qaeda.
Osborne.
He doesn't just work here, he works in all the other funeral homes around that.
Yeah.
Brian Leonard owns.
Oh, you won't work in all of Leonard's.
Oh yeah.
Whenever
Brian,
he's needed.
Brian Leonard's.
Yeah,
homes.
Brian Leonard. He has a home in Al-Qaeda, which I've helped many times. I've helped at Edgewood. He has a home. I've helped at Manchester, because sometimes the help just isn't available. Where he has good help, but sometimes the help has other things to do too.
He knows when there's a good man.
Thank you. No comments.
And so, and now we want to show this clock. They have something they want to tell about this clock. And we don't want to run out of tape, and I still have some things to talk about, ask about, but we'll see.
Well, this clock was,
On
still works, yeah.
Can you get it, Ken?
Okay. This clock still keeps good time, and when I wake up at night, instead of looking at my clock in the bedroom what time it is, I wait until I hear it strike. And sometimes when it strikes 5 or 6, I'll think, oh, I wish it wasn't that morning yet. And then sometimes it'll strike 2 and I wish it was morning. So it just depends on your night's rest. See.
Please tell us the story of the clock.
Okay, this clock was in the store when Lena Baumgartner bought the store from Adam Boland. And Adam Boland was one of the merchants years and years ago. I'm sure some of the vicinity remember Adam Boland. And so then Lena bought it from Adam Boland. Well, then I bought half interest in the store. She paid only $5 for this clock from Adam Boland. So when I bought half interest, I paid $2.50 for it. So 4 years later, when I bought my full share of the store, I paid Lena $2.50 for her share. So this clock is maybe 100 years old, and I've only got about $5 invested in it.
Do you know what kind of a clock?
It's oh gosh,
Isn't it on the front side underneath?
I've been moving it. It'll probably quit. What?
Right, doesn't matter.
Well,
That is.
it is in the set. What they call? I don't know.
St. Thomas.
It is. I don't think it's a Seth Thomas.
Oh yeah.
You could.
But it's a really
Yes, it's
marvelous clock.
Yes, and I'll tell you, it used to be dark. They used to use the dark varnish, and of course to match our chiffonier out there, Gladys took and removed all the dark varnish and got it down where it matches the
They
chest.
say you're not supposed to do that to an old clock, but it was black.
Mhm.
It was on a shelf not far from the furnace dome, and all that made it completely black.
I tell you, I'm not partial to clocks, but I'd pay you $5.
No, the
Not
price
for sale.
the price just went up. The price just went up.
Okay, are we getting pretty close? But you haven't run out on the tape yet, though. Okay. I need to have you tell me what Upper Town, Lutra, West Elgin, which is all the same thing.
Mhm.
What is it like right today as far as businesses? How has it changed?
Okay, the business today, the only business up there today in West Elgin, I would say, is the new business up there since I moved out of West Elgin is Fob's Implement, but now that has recently been sold to the Nelsons down here that are going to go up there.
And
So
tell what Nelsons are.
yeah, it's I believe his nickname is Doc Nelson. I don't know what his first name is, but he's Joe Nelson's son, and they've been operating a business down here in Fob's Garage. I don't know what it's called.
Gridworks.
Gridworks. So Gridworks are moving from Fob's old building up to what was the Implement up West Town.
And they have just begun making, they're kind of ornamental wooden things from pinball, old pinballs.
Yes,
Football.
yeah. And I understand their staff is quite expanded, and I think there's quite a few that work for Fob up here can stay right up there and be employed, which is great. Another new business up there is the medical clinic, which we're very thankful for, and the veterinary clinic, which we don't use. Our only pet is this dog out here. And then the Jiffy Mart, that does quite a bit of business up there.
That's the second Jakey's.
That's the second Jakey's, and it's sort of it's kind of nice to have a place like that because they hire young people, and it's kind of a good hangout, but it seems like it's a clean hangout. I never see too much rowdiness up there. It isn't like a honky-tonky place. It's just the kids go in there because their friends and so forth work there. Then the Homestead Apartments, I call that a business too, the Homestead, because it's about, 20 units up there or so. And other than that, all the other businesses in Lutra have been discontinued. The stores and the lumber yard. And I think these are the only businesses that exist.
There weren't very many people living in our end of town when we first started there.
Right.
Go ahead.
The only two kids that was in West Elgin, the railroad tracks and all the way west, going to Claremont, was Hiram Belva Olson had a little girl by the name of Linda Olson. And Charlie Cappers had the boy by the name of Charles. There was two kids in that whole end of town.
Mm.
And then as the years went by, as homes were built and so forth, it really expanded, and the young couples moved in, and like just say for example, I'm trying to think of Metzger, Irvin Metzger and Ruth got married. They had a family, and Wheelers moved up there.
Yeah.
They had a family, and it's expanded, and there's quite a few youngsters up there in town. Chapman's, they got married. Bob and Sheila, they had a family. So what I mean, it grew. But when I stopped to think of the only two kids in the west part of town, those two, and they were quite a difference in age too.
One business that you had mentioned was, but it's not there now, is the Metzger stockyards.
Yes, I should have mentioned that. Sure, George Metzger ran a stockyard right across from Don Fowler's. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Yes, yeah, that was pretty. They did a lot of buying and selling. Yeah.
And that lasted quite a long time.
Oh yes, that lasted as long as George was able to operate it.
And then one more thing, I don't think anybody's mentioned, but do you remember when Adam Bolin collected scrap iron?
Yes,
Say something about that, because I remember just a huge pile.
Okay, he was had this scrap. was in the location where Alf and Ina Ruckdash's house that burnt down. Remember, about 15 years ago, Alf and Ina Ruckdash's house burned to the ground, and that was where his business stood. And he bought junk of any kind, anything that he could pay a farmer for junk that he could get a little money out of, he bought. And he bought hides and furs, you know, if you'd skin a muskrat or whatever it was, he'd buy the hide.
Did he make good money? Because you know he did leave some money to the
Yes.
library and to
Yes.
the park.
He must have made some money because this park in the west end of town is in his memory.
Yeah.
And of course, that still is existing. It's a nice playground for the children. And he was never married. He was never married. Yeah.
Okay, I got one more thing. Is
Okay.
there time?
Well,
Okay, the oldest houses in Elgin.
Well, you know, we kind of talked about that, and some of the oldest houses in Elgin have all been razed. I mean, all been demolished, and I can't think of any existing one. I think this one across from our store up there has a lot of age to that. That's where this young,
I'm sure it does.
yes, I think that's one of the oldest ones. It's right up on the sidewalk, and other than that, there used to be an old house over here that Aussie, Awesome. Well, anyway, right in the vicinity of where the Lutheran Church.
Awesome.
Halverson, yeah.
Yeah.
There was an old house that stood up in that territory, right? Neighbors where Miss Vidor lives now. I can remember that old house.
Now, the Methodist parsonage is 1876.
Okay.
74.
74,
okay.
1874,
Okay.
and Arden said that the original part of his house was about that same age, I believe.
Okay, all right. Mm-hmm.
And so I wondered, you know, we were just kind of wondering if some of the houses still existed that were back in the
Okay.
turn of this, you know.
Well, a couple old houses are down in this street where Frieden has his welding shop. Remember, those houses were moved down. The staff lived in one that burnt down a few years ago, maybe about 25 years ago. And the other house is where Geraldine Winnie Bittigopher lived.
Yes.
And that house was moved in, I think, from back beyond Don Fauser's gas station, somewhere down in there.
And I know the old Suter house was considered an old one that
Yes. Where this-
below where she lives.
Oh, Marie Anderson?
Mhm.
Yes, that was an old house, and I think that may have still been standing, but didn't one of the floods do a lot of damage, and they figured better that it be removed?
Okay, I think we are going to run out of time, so
Well-
I want to thank you.
Well, yes, I hope
we hit a gold mine. You have wonderful stories, and you
well,
told them so well.
He
Well,
does a good job.
no,
He likes to talk.
I
Well, you spoke well also, Gladys.
don't give me any
And
credit.
we